Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. Alright, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I'm your host, Zach Bitter, and I want to welcome everyone to this episode of the show. As a way to thank the listeners for helping me grow this podcast over the years, I'm going to continue a raffle option for all of you to have a chance to win a free consultation with me. So it's a 30-minute consultation that I will raffle off once per month. All you have to do to enter is share the episodes that you enjoy on whatever platform you find most interesting. The only thing I ask you to do is, if it's a social media channel, make sure you tag me so I see it and can save that and enter in the raffle. Or if it's somewhere else that you can't tag me at, take a screenshot and send that to me at hpopodcast@gmail.com. You can also enter the raffle by writing a show review on your favorite podcast listening platform. So if you do that, take the screenshot, send it to hpopodcast@gmail.com, and I will enter you in that monthly raffle. Also, I'm excited to announce that I launched a new group coaching option. So to go along with my personalized one-on-one coaching options and my pre-made plans that I have on my website at zachbitter.com, this year I'm starting a group of online endurance runners who want to work with me in a slightly different model. So this model is set up so that whether you're a beginner or advanced, you can join. Whether you're training for something like a 5K or something as far as a 200 plus miler, you are welcome, and this setup will help you reach your goals. The way I have it set up is, if you subscribe, you will have access to my full catalog of training plans, which range from beginner 5K all the way up to advanced 200 plus miles. Along with that plan that you're going to use, you will have access to a weekly group meeting where you can ask questions about training. You can ask about adjustments to the plan to make it more personalized to you. You can engage with the other group members if you want. We'll get you all set up and ready to really personalize that plan to make sure that you're heading in the right direction for your event. Also, you will have access to office hours, where if you have something you want to ask and you want to just hop in and ask a question, you'll be given access to that as well. I will be bringing in guest speakers who have a deep understanding of specific topics and things that we'll use to better your training and recovery process throughout the course of the year, as well as a private forum for all the members to engage with one another, share stories, share training tips, and just house a lot of the information that we'll go over on the daily and weekly basis as you're pursuing your race goals. So if you're interested in checking that out, just head to my website at zachbitter.com, go to the coaching tab. From there, you'll be directed to the team coaching option, and you can sign up for that and get onboarded to join the group. If you're interested in keeping up with what I'm up to, please give me a follow on some of my socials. Follow me on Instagram at ZachBitter, on X, Twitter at ZBitter, and check out the brand new HPO podcast handles, which are just at HPO Podcast on Instagram and X/Twitter. Of course, all this stuff can be found quite easily on my website, which is the main landing page for everything I do at zachbitter.com. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this podcast sponsors include S-Fuels. They have a 15% offer for you. Element Electrolytes, they have a free sample pack offer for you. John G Apparel has 10% off, and Delta G Ketones has a 20% off and free consultation offer for you. Links and details can be found in the show notes and the episode landing page. You can also check out a full description of how I use all of these products in my own training and racing at the end of this podcast episode. Today, I've got a topic episode for you, and it's kind of a bit of a reflection, actually. So recently, I was able to go out to the Cocodona 250, which the Cocodona events are actually more than one event. There's the kind of big one, the 250 miler that begins just north of Phoenix, and then they travel up through Sedona and eventually into Flagstaff to cover 250 miles of desert trail. I should say desert and kind of high pine trail. And it's a doozy, as you can imagine, 250 miles. There's no easy way to go 250 miles. But inside of that event, Aravaipa, the organization that puts it on, has also included an event called the Sedona 125, which this year was the second year of that event, and then the Eldon 38, which was the inaugural event for it this year. So one of the reasons I went out to the event this year was because on my coaching side of things, I actually had 6 athletes participating in those 3 events. I had 2 doing the 250, 3 doing the 125, and 1 doing the 38. So as a coach, I want to try to get out to some of the events this year when I have multiples of clients there, or if the event offers something that would be what I would consider like a really good educational opportunity for me as a ultra endurance runner and as a coach. And now that these 200 milers are getting more and more popular, it just made a lot of sense for me to go out for this one, because there's just multiple reasons for me to check it out, just to see the whole event, to help out with some crewing and pacing with my coaching clients that were there, and to kind of just see some of the stuff we were strategizing and training and how they actually played out, and hopefully learn and refine some of the stuff. So this episode more or less is just gonna be kind of reflecting on some of the things that I think were interesting or unique about this event. And then I'll compare to some degree maybe what they would be like compared to typical ultra marathons, if you want to even say that. I mean, there's just so many ultra marathons now, it's hard to even say like, oh, this is the average ultra marathon. I mean, there's some characteristics that tend to be more consistent and things that are a little unique sometimes that are very much worth considering if you find yourself doing an event that kind of includes those. So let's get into it. One of the things I think that makes the Cocodona events really unique is both the 250 and the 125, they have just a very, very difficult start. There's no way to really arrive at the first major checkpoint without probably feeling like you've maybe overextended yourself a little bit, or that you're craving that aid station a little bit more than you would like to in your mind's eye, given where you are on the course and how much running you have left. So for example, for the 250, you start out, they start at 5 a.m. So you quickly end up heading into kind of some hot weather, hot desert weather. And it's basically a climb up to this spot called Crown King. And it's roughly 38 miles into the race. And there's just not a lot of great spots between the start and that first major aid station to really provide any support for the runners. So right out the gate, you have like a mandatory gear list of different things you have to have with you. And that does change from one degree to the next in some cases, because as you can imagine, if you're running a 250-mile race, there's parts where you're kind of up a little higher when you're closer to Flagstaff at night where it's going to get cold, and you definitely want to be prepared for cold weather. And then there's going to be the heat of the day in the desert where you're going to need a lot more fluids than normal, and you're needing to be prepared for that hot desert sun. And when you have large gaps between support, that just means during stretches like that, the mandatory gear list is going to be a little heavier on how much fluid you have to carry. So for Cocodona specifically, they had a minimum carrying amount of 4 liters of fluid. So that's a lot of water weight. And right out the gate, that basically tells me one thing as a coach, and it's, if you're going to have to be carrying that level of gear, that level of extra weight, it does definitely behoove a runner, a participant, to be getting accustomed to that scenario where they're not just out there moving at goal race pace, but moving with the type of setup that they're going to have to deal with for portions of this event. So, you start getting these heavy packs and stuff like that. That probably means you're going to end up hiking more than you would normally if you didn't have to have that pack, just due to that extra weight. You're going to want to get used to knowing what it feels like to have that much extra weight on you. You're also going to want to have to know things like, how is my pack and how it sits on me with the different types of clothing I'm wearing and things like that. How does that change from one section of the course to the next in terms of how that pack maybe chafes you? So like, maybe you run in your pack in normal conditions and there's one spot that bothers you, but everything else seems fine, so you take care of that one spot. But then perhaps when you add 4 liters of water, you get the desert sun, the rest of your gears may be a little bit differently. A lot of times in the dry heat, you want to keep covered with like light colored clothing and things like that. So maybe that pack rubs a little differently in that scenario. And you want to be prepared for how that's going to be versus how maybe it will be when you don't have to carry quite as much fluid with you near the end stage of the race, when you're up high, closer to Flagstaff, and going through the night when the weather is a little more chilly, on the chilly end of things. So that's just kind of like one example of what I think makes Cocodona unique, is just the sheer distance of it, and the fact that it kind of starts in the desert and then you end up into the pines in Flagstaff. You're crossing like just a variety of different kind of climates. And then you add just the weather fluctuations in desert climates from the heat of the day to the cool of the night in general. And even if you'd stay in the same spot, you're going to have a fair bit of variance there. So going into the event, I just knew, like with my clients that were certainly ones doing the 250, but in general, we're going to have to be ready for that sort of a variance in kind of what different preparations you will need for different phases of the race. So if I fast forward a little bit and head into the Sedona 125, you sort of have a similar setting where you have a really long stretch that goes through a very hot section of the course. So the 125ers, they started in a spot called Jerome, which is a little higher, so it wasn't quite as warm, but you hit an exposed hot area going into Sedona during the heat of the day, and you don't see your crew until that first aid station there, which again is roughly like, I think it was 37 miles in, if I remember correctly, the first major aid station in Sedona. And it's just one of those things where, just like with the 250, you're going to probably come into that aid station thinking to yourself, this could get really tough, or this is maybe a little tougher than I thought it would be, or I feel like I've been working a little harder than what 37 miles would give me in the context of pacing myself for 125. So I think the kind of general theme I took away from those two portions of this event was, when you get these long events, these 250 milers and 125 milers, they are just kind of an extrapolation of what I think with 100 miles, which is, if you think you're going slow enough, you're probably still going too fast. And I would lean on just basically kind of the overall data we have with ultra runners and how their kind of pace depreciates over the course of an event to kind of justify that most people probably are going out a little too fast in general. As a community of runners, we're probably all going out just a little too fast in general in most cases in order to like really optimize the finishing time. So when you have scenarios where the event is drawn out even further, and you have these components where you have an environment that is going to just be that much more harsh, and you're potentially going to be giving back more for every match, so to speak, that you burn in that area of the course, it just becomes a little bit more consequential if you make a mistake in that phase of that course. So one of the interesting things that I noticed, I was at the Sedona aid station the longest, I think, and saw the most runners in that one. And one thing that I saw through there was just, most runners were coming into there looking like a little bit like they'd seen a ghost. not quite as fresh as maybe I would have imagined someone would want to look at that phase. It wasn't necessarily like bad. I mean, there were definitely people who had really good races at the end of the day. So it's just kind of partly a reality of just kind of like the ebb and flow of what you're going to have in an ultra marathon to some degree. But the interesting thing that I saw amongst that group of people was runners that came through that aid station and sort of took the opportunity to kind of refocus and reset tended to do better or go out into the next phase of the course with a little bit of less of a just frantic nature and kind of like regain control and regain perspective versus like coming into that aid station thinking like, okay, I got to hurry up and get out of here. I got to do this, I got to do that, and then get out, and then kind of rush themselves a little bit. What I find when people do that is you sort of have this situation where in order to really kind of wrap your head around what you're trying to do in an event like this, you kind of need to have these break points in the event where you have a chance to kind of almost just like shut things down momentarily and then start back up, to the degree where in your mind you're thinking, all right, I finished that stage, that's done, that's complete, check it off the list. Now it's time to kind of refocus and focus on the next section, versus feeling like there's this continuation between that stage and the next stage that doesn't have any cognitive breaks from it. So my one big takeaway is when you get these main aid stations where you have good crew support, you have great aid station support, when you're planning ahead of time, while you're planning the logistics of just like, what do I have to replace in my pack to have myself set to be out there and have the water and have the electrolytes and have the fuel that I'm going to need for the next section of the course, also be thinking, how do I calm myself down to the degree where I actually feel like I can like actually take the moment to say, all right, I finished that section, that's done, mission accomplished. Now let's just kind of move on to the next step and almost create like another or more events within the event to focus on and minimize kind of the target time frame that you need to cognitively wrap your head around at any given time. I think that's a big value add, and it's one thing that it's not something that stands out the way like, oh, I need to have X amount of calories or X ounces of fluid or my electrolytes or something like that, where people are more intuitively understanding that those things are necessary to have before they leave. So that was one of the big things I noticed. The other thing I just like was thinking about in general along those lines is like aid station time or non-moving time in general. So there is a pretty wide variety of what you see with an event like this. You'll see people that have a more skewed moving to non-moving time, meaning like they spend more time not moving, and their average pace from like the second the race starts to the second they cross the finish line is skewed slower because they're just taking more time in aid stations. And then there's going to be people that don't sleep at all for something like this, but also end up maybe moving a little bit slower at times. So I talked to some of the people that I thought would be interesting, have interesting takes on this, because I think as you get further into the middle and the back of the pack, stopping and taking rest breaks and naps and things like that are just going to be more likely to occur because you're just out there longer. Like if you're finishing in, let's say, almost 5 days versus at the very front of the pack, the top runners this year were finishing right around 60 hours. So you're going through more nights, you're losing more sleep, you're going to have more sleep fatigue than say the people who are up front finishing a little bit sooner. So it also becomes something where like, depending on your goal finishing time or your outcome, the strategy is going to be a little different. So it becomes more of a like, what is your duration and how do we structure things for that? So if your duration is, I'm going to win this race and break the course record versus I'm going to just barely make it through the cutoffs, you're almost doing a different event at that point when it comes down to strategizing the non-moving time side of things. It's similar where you don't want to waste time. I mean, wasted time is wasted time. So you do want to be efficient, but I think the opportunity to accidentally not take enough time to make sure you take care of yourself is just a heavier variable than say it would be in a race like, let's say, Western States, where if you make a mistake in an aid station at Western States, it's not good, but you're probably going to be in another aid station inside of the next 5 miles. So you can remedy it much sooner. Whereas at Cocodona, if you make a mistake at a major aid station, you might not be able to fix that mistake or remedy it for hours, in some cases, multiples of hours. So you can have, you can have like an 8-hour stretch in some cases. So it's just one of those things where I think you have to be a little more cognizant of what is the actual opportunity cost of making a mistake here and then having to try to remedy it without having the resources that you would at a typical ultra marathon. And what that means to me is just when you're planning out your pacing strategy, being just a little more generous with how much time you plan to spend at these these major aid stations, just to make sure that you don't cost yourself hours by trying to save minutes because of something like tactical that could have been managed better due to the specifics of that type of an event. The other interesting one that kind of fits within this was I was talking a little bit with Jeff Browning, who finished second this year after the race, and we were just chatting about like, when is the right time to start considering taking a nap? And Jeff's thinking from the perspective of competing for the win, so it's going to be that kind of framework. And I think the pressure with that group of people is to try to sleep as little as possible, because if you lay down and take a nap, you have this situation where you kind of also have other guys who are in close proximity, other runners in close proximity to you who maybe aren't going to. And then if you take a 30-minute nap and they keep moving, they may add 2-3 miles to a lead or close that gap or pass you in that time frame. And there's this like kind of competitive just angst that you're going to have when a situation like that occurs. So you do want to be mindful of, one, are you actually going to be able to fall asleep and make it worth it? Because if you think, I'm going to plan a time to sleep here, and then you lay down and you can't turn your brain off because you're constantly just thinking about that next runner who's behind you, or that runner that came into the aid station with you that's not taking a nap, and you just lay there and don't sleep, then you did kind of just waste that time for the most part. Versus a scenario where you feel tired enough to fall asleep, you take a nap, and because you took that nap, you sort of reset your brain and you wake up feeling a lot more ready to kind of attack the next section of the course. And then maybe your moving time improves to the degree that that 20 to 30 minute nap gets completely eclipsed and overtaken by the additional speed that you added to your pace for that next, hours, if not day, if you go there. So one thing Jeff mentioned is he's leaning towards thinking that like sleeping a little earlier probably pays off in the long run versus trying to kind of push further into the event and fight that off. And I think I agree with that. I think taking a nap early, if you can, if your body allows you to do it, should be something you're willing to do, even if it's something where you look around and other people kind of in that same pace category as you are not doing it yet. I think sleeping early, if the sleep pressure is heavy enough, is going to be a value add at the end, versus avoiding that and then finding yourself, later on just moving much slower because you're fighting an additional variable of like heavy sleep pressure that you could have potentially teased out. The other interesting thing that Jeff mentioned was like, you kind of have these different types of sleep strategies. When I was out there crewing, I had some clients that they took up to a 90-minute nap, which that's a pretty good reset. You're getting a full sleep cycle in 90 minutes. And if you get that, you're likely going to have a much longer stretch of time before you start feeling that sleep pressure catch up on you again, versus a scenario where, let's say you're out on the trail, you're between aid stations, and you're just feeling the sleep pressure to the degree where you're like, I could just lay down and take a nap anywhere on the trail. And this is one of the unique things I think you see at something like Cocodona 250 is if you're out there doing it, you might just come across a runner lying on the side of the trail taking a nap. And these kind of trail side naps, they tend to be much shorter in duration. They can be like as short as a minute, but kind of like usually in this like 1 to maybe 10, 15 minute time frame. And what Jeff was saying about those is like you get these like little trail naps and they do help, but they're very fleeting in terms of how long that impact lasts. So contrasting that with something that's a little longer, like a 30, 60, 90 minute nap at a major aid station versus a 5-minute trail nap, you're just going to only get you're going to get a shorter term kind of rebound from that. So there seems to be some degree of payoff beyond just, I took a nap or I didn't take a nap. That fits into the duration of it, even with all the adrenaline and everything kind of goes into this stuff. So I found that really interesting too. Along those same lines, just sleeping in general, I think one strategy that I went into this event with my clients and I came away thinking, okay, that this is probably the way to do it, is I don't think you can get too strict about when you're going to sleep though. I don't think you can say like, all right, when I get to aid station at mile, let's just say 92, they've got a good setup for sleeping there, or maybe your crew's there with a camper van or something, I'm going to take a nap there. If you get in there with like that rigid of a scenario, there's a good chance you're just not going to actually be able to fall asleep and kind of have what I said before, where you just lay there and kind of waste your time. I think what you want to do is you want to have like kind of a scaffolding of like, where are some spots that I would likely want to sleep? And some of those I think stand out a little bit. If you have like an aid station where you're coming through at a time when you're normally sleeping, so let's just say like 2 a.m. in the morning, and it's like the second night, there's a higher than average chance that you're going to be tired enough to sleep at that spot, especially if you haven't done much sleeping yet. So doing that in a way where you kind of have in your list of things like, if I'm tired enough to sleep here, if the sleep pressure is such that I know I could just lay down and fall asleep almost immediately, that's a spot I'm going to do it. And you can sort of like mark some of these optimal spots just to have in the back of your mind or on your crew's list so that they're ready for that when you come in, and then you are efficient with that and you're not wasting time trying to kind of like figure out, okay, I didn't plan on sleeping here, but I'm super tired, so I'm going on. And then you and your crew waste next 10, 15 minutes getting something set up where you can actually fall asleep versus you coming in, them thinking there's a good chance they're going to sleep here. We have everything set up. If they come and say, hey, I'm really tired, we can have you laid down, covered up, napping in a matter of minutes, and then save a bunch of time on over the course of the race if you kind of have those structures set up. And then just also like kind of what I was alluding to before, being comfortable with potentially taking a trail nap or something if you need to along the way if that sleep pressure comes in. The other thing I found interesting about that too is just like the timing of caffeine. So if you have that general idea of like, okay, I have this really good opportunity to sleep at this specific aid station, and you want to make sure that you increase the odds that you are going to actually be tired enough to fall asleep at that aid station and take advantage of that situation. To me, that just means being mindful of kind of when you're taking caffeine hits in doses during the race. You might want to be paying attention to that. So like, let's say you have a scenario where you're planning on, let's say again, arriving at that major aid station at 2 a.m. and you're roughly 3 hours out, it's 11 p.m. and you're thinking to yourself, I feel like maybe I could take some caffeine, or let's say you have two gels. You have a caffeine gel and a non-caffeinated gel. If you can tolerate it, I would say go with a non-caffeine gel there so that when you do get to the aid station, you're less likely to have that optimal sleeping opportunity get taken from you because of just the mistiming of the caffeine that could have otherwise been done a little bit differently. So thinking about stuff like that, I think is just kind of the way you want to go with it. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this podcast sponsors include S-Fuels. They have a 15% offer for you. Element Electrolytes, they have a free sample pack offer for you. John G Apparel has 10% off, and Delta G Ketones has a 20% off and free consultation offer for you. Links and details can be found in the show notes and the episode landing page. You can also check out a full description of how I use all of these products in my own training and racing at the end of this podcast episode. The other one thing that I was really thinking about during the course of this event was if I go back to kind of what I was talking about before, where that first stretch for the Cocodona 250, there's like this long stretch where you go through the heat, very little support. They had like a water drop in there, which I guess this year someone stole a bunch of the water. So the runners had like a rationing of how much water they could pick up at this water drop. And their rations, I believe I remember correctly, got cut in half because of the water theft. So it's like, it's just one of those things where it's like, if you planned the bare minimum going into that, and now you find out you get half ration refill, you could find yourself in a lot of trouble, and then ultimately like playing catch up for a large portion of the next, stretch of the race, or having to kind of take a longer than needed or expected break at the next aid station because of it. These are the sort of things you kind of have to consider when you're getting into this. There's a lot of uncertainties that you can't necessarily plan or account for. So when you're like deciding how aggressive to get, keeping in mind things like that do happen or can happen, and you want to make sure you balance those risks with what is it going to be like to say like, well, they're asking for us to take 4 liters, but technically I could carry 6. So should I carry 6 or should I carry the minimum 4? And, I think when you're in those early stages like that, taking a little more than what the minimum is in most cases probably a good idea. But it kind of leads me into the next thing, which is just the thought process I've been having that I think is really interesting about the sport, where, we consider ourselves endurance athletes for obvious reasons with these ultramarathons and these 200 milers, but really there's so many more variables outside of just like your capability as an endurance athlete that will impact how you're able to perform on a course like this or an event like this, that I think actually potentially identifies different groups of people that maybe otherwise wouldn't necessarily shine in a typical endurance event. And one of those things is like processing limits and fluid loss rates, and even to some degree like electrolyte loss. So the way I was thinking about this was like, if you're somebody who, let's say you lose a lot of fluid per hour from just sweat, and you have a scenario like at Cocodona and Sedona where you have this long stretches of distance and time and heat where you only have access to so many fluids, you may have an issue with processing limits where if you're losing well above and beyond what your body's actually be able to process, even if you can carry that fluid, it may not be something that you can tolerate by just sort of forcing it down. There's like a potential limit, or not a potential, there is a limiter, and everyone's going to be a little different with this. There's going to be like population averages, but then there's going to be people on either side of that kind of average in terms of how much fluid they can actually take in and process at any given time and get away with it and have it actually work out in their favor. So I just wonder sometimes with these events like this, like if we get enough competitive pressure with them over the years, will we just start selecting for people who have these like really efficient fluid loss rates and have these like higher than average processing limits? So like not only are they losing less fluid, but they're also able to process higher amounts of fluid and just things like that. You can keep going on and on with this one too, because there's also just like electrolyte loss. So I've done a lot of content on electrolyte loss and things like that with different guests and solo topic based episodes in the past. But like if you remember from some of those, I mean, you can have people that are as low as 200 to 300 milligrams per liter of sweat. And then you have people as high as over 2 grams. So you're looking at like a 10x essentially from like those polar ends. Granted, most people are going to fall somewhere in the middle, but again, with enough competitive pressure, do we find a scenario where there's like this kind of sweet spot where maybe you lose a minimal amount of electrolytes per liter of fluid and therefore are just more efficient with one more logistic that could potentially go wrong? It gets to be like a situation where I think like if you struggle with heat and hydration and things like that, you can almost overcorrect. And I think we may have saw this. I don't think he'll mind me sharing. He's been public about it. Mike McKnight had like a really interesting situation where he retained a ton of fluid. I think he weighed nearly 20 pounds more after the race than he did before the race, which when you think about is like, you know, traveling 250 miles partially through extreme heat and managing to actually retain more fluid than you lost. Something's going wrong there, right? You're overshooting your fluid processing, or you have an electrolyte imbalance that's creating an increase in fluid retention that wouldn't otherwise be there. And I mean, for Mike, it's not like he was just being totally haphazard about it as far as I can tell. I think it was just a product of he's been doing this race now for years and he's had a lot of issues with dehydration. So for him, he's probably more fearful of not getting in enough fluids, and the more likely mistake for him to make at that point is not to, again, find himself without enough, but force himself to have more than he probably can process and end up in a situation like he did this year. A lot of moving parts with that one though too, between just like sodium and potassium balance and things like that. So, you know, there's a lot to unpack with that. And I think that's just something where with a sport like this and the relatively limited amount of research we have and the research we do have being extrapolated, you know, into multiple days versus shorter duration things is where I think a lot of the guesswork ends up happening with people like that. So, I mean, you can do some basic things like you can test your sweat loss rates and find out like, well, how much liter of sweat do I lose per hour of running when I'm in like cooler temperatures, moderate temperatures, and hot temperatures, and start kind of putting together some ballpark figures and then looking at data in terms of processing limits and things like that and just deciding like, you know, maybe it's a bad idea to try to force 3 liters of water into the system at one given time or in an hour time, because it's just not going to process that much. So it's not doing yourself a favor to do that, even if you feel like you're going to lose that much. So to some degree, I think like this all kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, where if you need to be more conservative with like pace and effort early on, because you know yourself to be somebody who has a harder time with processing limits or fluid intake, fluid loss, and that sort of thing, it just might be something where like when you look at like a race like this length, everyone is going to have strengths and everyone is going to have weaknesses. So the closer you can get to identifying where your strengths and weaknesses are and where they can be taken advantage of on the course, it just kind of draws a personal blueprint for you in terms of what spots you want to make sure you're not taking risks, you're not burning matches, and then which areas you can potentially do that. Because my general mindset with this stuff is like, if you're operating on a spot that is your relative weakness, that's just not the spot you should be taking risks. And if you're in a spot where like this is a relative strength of mine, if there's a time to take a risk or a time to be a little more aggressive, that's going to be the spot, because our error margin is just going to be larger through there. This entire like stuff I've been talking about so far just kind of highlights one of the topics I want to talk about with Cocodona and Sedona, which is just uncertainties. It's just one of those things where I think an ultra marathon in general, especially as you get into the longer ones, there's this sort of like there's this sort of mindset I like to teach that is like there's going to be something that happens that you don't have a perfect plan for, that we didn't sit down and say, okay, when this happens, this is what you do. So you need to be kind of aware that the likelihood of that happening is almost certain when you get into a race as long as 250 miles. And some of it's going to be controllable and some of it's going to be uncontrollable, meaning some of it's going to be something where when you find out that you made a mistake or that something bad happened, you could think to yourself, okay, I messed up. I should have done that differently. Had I done that differently, I would be in a better spot right now. Or it could be something totally out of your control. So some examples would be like that water theft. Like nobody going into the race at Cocodona probably sat down and in their plan said, okay, this is what we do if someone comes and steals half the water at that first water drop. So that's an unpredictable uncertainty, but you still have to deal with it. So the mindset then is like, okay, I've just been dealt this new set of cards. What's the best play here based on what I have available to me versus trying to kind of like force what you were going to before with the prior expectations. So sort of like being able to recalibrate expectations based on circumstances that are outside of your control. The other one would be things, but you just found yourself in a situation where you made a mistake. So maybe it was like, okay, I only brought 4 liters of fluid with me for that first section. I took the minimum. I really needed 5. And you get to a point where you realize you needed 5. It's too late to go back and remedy that. So it's really easy to let your mind kind of beat yourself up in that situation. And then anytime you're kind of struggling, just think like, oh man, if I could have gone back and done that differently, I screwed up. If you keep beating yourself up like that, that's just such a cognitive burden that you're laying on yourself. And like the people that I find are able to better manage those situations are the ones that accept, okay, I made a mistake here. Pretty much everyone else is going to make a mistake at some point too. Mine's happening now. So since I can't go back and do anything about it, just like the uncertainties, I need to refocus and decide what's the best path forward from here to the point where I can kind of course correct. And I need to focus on that versus what is behind me. And that I think kind of spins the mind into spending your mental energy on like the positive aspects or the things that you can actually do versus burning that mental energy on things that you can't go back and do. If you want to beat yourself up over it, wait till after the race. Beat yourself up over it and use that as an opportunity to learn. Use that as an opportunity to say like, okay, that was a tactile mistake on my part. If I do a race like this again, I'm going to make sure I don't have that issue happen, or now I have more information that I didn't have before. So put that on the list of things to account for next time I do this so we can refine the process and do a better job next time. But you need to be able to kind of separate that time to address that topic in that situation as to when you do that and when not to do it, and when to not do it is during the race, when to do it is after the race when you're looking at like what the learning opportunities are. Another thing that I think is just an interesting overall topic with this type of event is running versus hiking. So I think a lot of times, even with ultramarathon, we call it ultramarathon running a lot of times, and it's just like, I always kind of wonder about that. It's like, to what degree is it ultramarathon running versus, or maybe a better way to look at it is, where's the crossover point and at what finishing point for certain durations is it just as much or more hiking as it is running? And what do we do with that? So when you get to events like the Cocodona 250, regardless of whether you're winning the race or whether you're finishing right before the cutoff, the last finisher, you're going to be doing a bunch of hiking. It's just going to be something that's required to make it sustainable moving through that sort of terrain in those sort of conditions for that duration, with the amount of sleep deprivation and everything that goes into this. So it's one of those things too there, when you're sort of planning out, how do I structure my peaking phase for this particular event? If you have a lot of time to spend on the trails, or you're the type of person who just really likes long outings on the trails, I suspect most people probably are doing more running than they need to or should be doing, and less time hiking and practicing that skill set, to the degree where, like, not only are you sort of skewing your skills in an imbalanced way for what you're actually going to do on race day, but you're also putting yourself in a position where you're kind of setting an expectation in front of yourself through repetition as to what you should be doing when you're out there, which I think leads to people going out a little too fast. So, for example, if I looked at someone's race from beginning to end, and we noticed that, like, let's say through the first third of the race, they were doing like a 70%, 30% run to hike. Then the next 30%, they were doing a 50-50 hike to run. And then the last third, they were doing a 30% run, 70% hike. So we saw this like gradual shifting from majority run to 50-50 split to majority hike. That would be a sign to me that you're doing too much running and not enough hiking early on, or essentially going out too fast. And I think being a little more balanced in the early stages with being just a little more liberal with the hiking, even if it's an area where at that given time and in that kind of environment, normally you'd be able to run if it weren't for the fact that you had another, let's say 210 miles to go, you'd easily be able to do it. You have to be able to separate yourself from that reality that yes, you can run right now, but no, it's probably not going to be in your best interest. And then when you have a scenario like Cocodona and Sedona, where the further you get into the race, the better the weather gets for running, and the better the weather gets from avoiding things like overheating and dehydration and needing or having a situation where your fluid loss exceeds your fluid processing rates, you want to reserve some of that ability to run for those sections versus trying to force it in a section where you're already sort of overheating the system to some degree with the fluid processing and fluid loss side of things, and just the relative extra fatigue you're going to get trying to push harder through hotter temperatures and things like that. So that's kind of my ongoing plug, I think, for ultra runners in general, is assessing kind of your strategy between running and hiking and how to like really break that down so that you can kind of assess what is a better strategy. And the reality is you're not going to be perfect with this. So none of these things are like everyone is off, we need to find more perfect approaches. I think this is a game of margins where it's like, okay, if we unpack, let's say, 100-mile race that you did in the past, and we see that depreciation of pace or skewing the ratios of run to hike over the course, and now you're going to do something like Cocodona 250, chances are if your approach for the 100 was too aggressive and you do a similar strategy, it's going to be more amplified when you get out there longer like that. So it just is something where you want to be that much more conservative than you would have been otherwise. So at the end of the day, I mean, getting out there and coaching, I think my takeaways were some things that I think I would refine as a coach would be getting a little more specific about exactly what you want to kind of have prepared and how much time you may need in some of the major aid stations to really kind of hit that reset point in your mind and body to feel like when you go back out, you're kind of, okay, I'm ready to take on the next phase versus this is just a continuation of whatever suffering I experienced in that last stretch. And being maybe just a little less, let's see if we can like kind of shave a minute here, a minute there when you're in those particular spots of the course. The other one would be just like forcing just like a strategy that would maybe work better from a hydration standpoint in shorter ultramarathons, meaning like, okay, there's a good chance we can actually account for the majority of your fluid loss for this particular section by just being a little more aggressive with your hydration. There's just spots on this course where that just may not be the case, and I think you just have to slow things down in that case and accept that that's going to be something that you need to just move a little slower than maybe you would like, giving an optimal scenario in order to feel better later on in the race and ultimately finish sooner. The final thing would just be the relative predictability. I think I went in with a good understanding that there's going to be a lot of unpredictable things here, but I would say, if anything, it was probably a little less predictable than what I would have assumed after seeing it from start to finish. So I'd go in there with like a little bit more of a healthy mindset of making sure you're really, really clear about those unpredictability things and how that's going to be part of this process, and being very comfortable with that part of the approach is going to be important. And I think from a preparation standpoint, what that means, and one thing I did see when I was spending a lot of time in some of the aid stations, is there was a pretty heavy range between like how different runners had their crews structured. So oftentimes these runners would have one or more crew members there that would be helping them kind of get themselves set to go back out. So I think as a runner, your goal for some of these things is to be very detailed with your crews as to what you want them to do. So they're not leaning on you as much, because when you get in that aid station, if you feel like you're just on task in terms of telling people what to do, if you're like making orders and you're just kind of like responding to a bunch of questions and you're just like spending a lot of cognitive energy trying to help your crew help you, I see that as like something that's going to make it less likely for you to feel like you actually had a reset, to the degree when you go back out you feel reset, versus a scenario where you come in and there's probably going to be things that you need to let your crew know about that happened out there in that last stretch that you want to remedy. Like maybe you had a blister on your toe that you weren't predicting, and you have to tell your crew, okay, I got a blister on my big toe. We're going to have to pop my shoe and sock off and address that. But there's going to be a lot of things that I think that you just know going in that you're going to need and you're going to want. And if you have your crew with a spreadsheet or with some sort of setup where they know like, okay, this is my job. I have like these 3 things that I have to do and I have to be ready for it. And I'm not going to like bother the runner about it. I'm just going to execute. And unless I'm told by that runner to like alter that plan, that's the plan. So that you don't have, if you have multiple crew members, them sort of like trying to figure out on the fly who does this and who does what, or trying to figure out what you need. It's mostly detailed. So I think that kind of really helps with eliminating some of the predictable mistakes that can be made, or the predictable problems that you can avoid by just doing a little more planning. All right, so that was kind of my coaching the Cocodona breakdown. It was a lot of fun to be out there. It was something where I think it's such a unique, interesting aspect to ultra marathon running, and I'm excited that it has gotten to a point where now these 200 milers are also like very like well covered and respected parts of the sport, and I'm excited to see more people doing them, and as more competition enters these, see these finishing times get refined even further and better strategies put together and things like that, and ultimately hopefully do one myself just so I can get the actual experience of from what it's like to be the runner out there. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking around to hear more about how I use the products that sponsor the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I have updated a few things, so if you follow closely, you may notice some new details here. I have taken a lot of time identifying these brands, and I'm incredibly grateful that they have provided a product that I use routinely and are also interested in supporting my work here at the Human Performance Outliers podcast. So here is how I use them. S-Fuels is a product that follows a principle of right fuel at the right time. For me, this means I can anchor my nutrition in a fat-dominant way, but not neglect the powerful application of carbohydrates when they are needed. Their product lineup maps the low-carbohydrate dietary protocol that I have used for endurance since 2011. Here's how I use some of their product lineup and some of their second-generation products that they've just recently brought to market. First is their Zone 4 and Zone 5 product. I use these for intra-workout and race carbohydrate targets. I will use the Zone 4 in less glycolytic settings that still benefit from some carbohydrate, and Zone 5 for workouts that I prefer, workouts and races where I want to maximize my carb to other fuel source exogenous inputs. In short, I prefer Zone 5 when my carb inputs are at their highest and I want to kind of go straight to that source. Zone 2 is a fat-based powder that uses C8 and C10 MCTs that are combined with L-glutamine. I use this for lower intensity workouts to help promote higher fat oxidation rates without neglecting energy deficits. So in short, if I'm doing something longer and I want to keep carbs out, but I don't want to have a huge calorie deficit, Zone 2 plays a great role there. Revival is a post-workout race protein powder that I can easily add to some yogurt or a low-carb smoothie to quickly jumpstart the recovery process. I will use a product like this most often when I'm completing training sessions and have a lower appetite or desire to eat solid foods right after, but want to get a jumpstart on replacing some of the stuff that I left out there. Primed is my go-to caffeine source for training and racing. It combines green tea extract, L-carnitine, taurine, and B vitamins, which all combine to help support energy production, fat metabolism, and reduce perceived effort. Life Bars are a product that have been one of my favorites on the S Fuels lineup for some time now, and they are a great combo of healthy fats and protein that I can have prior to a big training session, race, or simply as a snack on heavier training days. Grain-free breakfast cereal is something that I can sub in for just about any time I would have put granola on something when I was a more moderate high-carb person. So this is a good substitute for that. Oftentimes I will put it on top of things like yogurt as a topper or something like that. If you're interested in more details about their product lineup, the science behind it, and everything else, head over to sfuelsgolonger.com for up to 15% off your next order. And stay tuned for some product giveaways and promos over the course of the year. I got introduced to Janji last year and have really enjoyed having some of their products in my running and gym rotation. Janji makes pants, shorts, outerwear, tops, and accessories. Janji apparel is made with durability in mind and is backed by a 5-year run everywhere guarantee. Each design is informed by a different part of the world through collaboration with local artists and in partnership with clean water nonprofits with whom they have contributed over $1 million donated to clean water solutions. Some key features that Janji really focuses on is lightweight, breathable, moisture wicking, odor resistant, thermal regulation, and a super soft and flexible material. Here are the products that I've been using a lot so far this summer. I'm still going with the AFO middle short for very light breathable training sessions where minimal pockets and extras are not desired. So think a very humid summer training run where I want as little on as I can get away with and feel like it's not getting bogged down with a bunch of sweat. The 5-inch multi-short. So I'll sub this one in for sessions where I do want a bit more storage capacity that is placed in the right areas or the right spots. So think things like where I put my phone, does it sit nicely? Or is there a spot to put my key where it's not flopping around or poking me in an awkward place or things like that. So I really like the 5-inch multi-short for that sort of a training session. A product I'm really excited about, which isn't necessarily a training gear per se, is the Multipass Mini and Sling Bags. These are the newest items I have started using from Janji. The only question for me is how much stuff do I need, which will determine which one of these I will bring with me. The Multipass is a great for just stashing things like your keys, wallets, phones, headphones, or any item you want to have with you, all while keeping your pockets free from clutter. It's got a nice clippable strap that you can put around your waist or over your shoulder. I'll upgrade to the sling bag if I'm bringing a little more stuff and it's just not enough room inside that Multipass Mini. So think things like the size of a water bottle, or if I'm just going to be on a little longer session or heading to the airport or something like that, and I just need more storage, but with that same type of design with the waist and shoulder options and the clippable strap. So those are two of my new favorite options. Check those out. You can head to janji.com and get 10% off any of those items as well as anything else they have on there by using promo code BITTER10 for 10% off. They're also available at REI. I will give one quick plug, although it's not winter or cooler. A couple other items that I have in my rotation when it does get cooler is the Repeat Merino long sleeve, the Rover Merino hoodie, the Trail Tights, and the Atlas multi-pant. I've been using Element electrolytes for quite some time now. Actually, a while back, I had a sweat test and it suggested that I lose 614 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid loss, meaning if I go out for a run and I sweat to the capacity where I lose a liter of fluid, I'm going to lose 614 milligrams of sodium along with that. So during these hot summer months, it's not uncommon that I will lose over a liter per hour when working out. So I favor adding some electrolytes to my workout fluids and pre-workout drinks in order to account for this. I also find it beneficial if I spend some time in the sauna and lose fluids fast that way. I currently have 3 approaches to using Element products. First is one of their warm beverage options in the morning with my coffee. Sometimes I'll put about half a pack of Element in there. Again, one of their warm beverage options. So usually that's something like chocolate mint, chocolate chai, chocolate raspberry, one of those. A second option is one of their fruity flavors in my water bottles while I'm training. So if I'm out there and I'm going through 16 to 20 ounce bottles of water, I'm going to sprinkle in some of that fruity element flavors into that in order to account for that 614 milligrams of sodium that I'm going to lose. Third is their newest option, which is their Sparkle product, which is just a 16 ounce carbonated can with the Element electrolyte powder in it already mixed for you. So I've been using these for long runs and before afternoon training sessions in the gym when I know my fluid loss has been high. So I've been doing a lot of long runs lately, and having a can of Sparkle there to kind of sip at in between pit stops in the heat to cool down and rehydrate have been a great new addition to my training lineup. Just a reminder, their core flavors include citrus, watermelon, orange, grapefruit, raspberry, chocolate, mango chili, and chocolate caramel. Some seasonal options include chocolate mint, chocolate chai, and chocolate raspberry. You can go to drinklmnt.com/HPO, throw in that /HPO, and you'll get prompted for a free sample pack with your purchase and help support the Human Performance Outliers podcast along the way. The reason I chose Delta G over other exogenous ketone supplements is they have the formula and the dosage that is supported by the research we have to date. They have the DARPA grant to design for special forces, 50+ research studies, and 20+ ongoing studies. They also have approximately 3 times the amount of ketones in their product than many of their competitors do, which can be critical for hitting the ketone target ranges that suggest potential cognitive and performance benefits. I've been playing around with my protocol a bit during this last training block, so it has changed a bit from what prior protocols you may have heard me mention on here. For like longer training sessions, these are going to be the key points that I'm going to do it. So it's going to be lower intensity but long in duration. I like the long runs. I like these for long runs and even ultra specific long runs, which tend to span beyond, say, 3 hours. And the way I will do this is I will take a bottle of Delta G Performance, that's the blue bottle I have on their website, about an hour into that training session. And then if that session goes beyond 3 hours, I will take a second one. If it doesn't, I will still take a second one post long run as a way to kind of kickstart things for whatever's coming up next. If you're interested in hearing more about it, I did record an episode with Brian McMahon. It's episode 351, Exogenous Ketones and Performance. And if you're also interested in checking more out about the product and signing up for a free consultation to find out how it would maybe fit your lifestyle, you can head to deltagketones.com. Feel free to throw in a promo code BITTER20 for 20% off your purchase of Delta G Ketones. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.